At 61, 3 days after she buried her father, Nora Kell had $308, a duffel bag, and the keys to a fishing boat nobody in the family wanted. Her brother Wade got the house on the hill and the accounts at the bank. Her sister Dana got her half and drove back to Boston before the coffee was cold. What they left Norah was the Delia, a 40-foot wooden dragger built in 1972, tied to the last slip on a rotting town pier, appraised at $4,000 against $2,150 in back mooring fees. Wade had offered her $500 to take it off her hands for scrap, and he'd smiled when he said it, the way you smile at a child who's been given the smallest slice on purpose. Norah signed nothing. She drove 3 hours down to the coast to see the thing they thought was worthless, and when she pried up the bolted steel plate under the bunk in the forward berth, she found what Amos Kell had spent 40 years quietly building, something the whole harbor remembered, even if his own daughter never knew it was there. The lawyer's office smelled like carpet cleaner and cold coffee. Norah sat in a chair with wooden arms while a man named Pried read the will out loud in a voice that had read 1,000 of them. Wade sat to her right in a pressed shirt with no tie, one ankle crossed over his knee, checking his phone between clauses. Dana sat on the far end, coat still on, purse in her lap like she might need to leave in a hurry. Nobody had saved Norah a seat next to anybody. She'd taken the one that was open. Some families split things down the middle. The Kells split them down the fault line that had run through the house since Norah was a girl. Pried turned a page. The residence at 14 Harrow Road, appraised at $240,000, together with its contents, passes to the decedent's son, Wade Amos Kell. Wade nodded once, like a man accepting a delivery he'd already paid for. The financial accounts held at Coastal Savings, totaling $186,400, are divided equally between Wade Amos Kell and Dana Kell Sorensen. Dana's shoulders came down half an inch, $93,000 each. Norah did the math without meaning to. She'd been a bookkeeper for 11 years at a lumberyard. Numbers arranged themselves in her head, whether she wanted them to or not. Then Pried looked over the top of his glasses, and his voice changed the way voices change when a man is about to hand you the part nobody fought over. To my daughter, Nora Delia Kell, he read. I leave the fishing vessel Delia, official number and documentation attached, together with her gear, her mooring, and everything aboard her. He paused. The vessel has been appraised at $4,000. The estate notes outstanding wharf and yard charges of $2,150, which transfer with the vessel to the beneficiary. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Wade laughed. Not a big laugh. A short one, through the nose, the kind a man lets out when the joke lands exactly where he thought it would. He left you the boat, Wade said. That's about right. Norah kept her hands flat on the wooden arms of the chair. That's about right, she said. Norah, I'm not being cruel. That boat hasn't turned $1 since he got too sick to run her. She's been sitting at that pier taking on rot for 2 years. The yard wants their money whether you keep her or not. Wade uncrossed his ankle and leaned toward her, elbows on his knees, the way he leaned when he was about to help you see reason. I'll give you $500 for her. Cash, this week. I'll eat the yard fees. You sign her over, you walk away clean, and you don't spend the next 10 years paying to keep a dead man's boat floating. Dana spoke without looking up. It's a generous offer, Norah, she said it, the way you say a thing you've been coached to say. Norah looked at her brother. He was 64 now, gray at the temples, tanned from a boat he kept for pleasure and never for work. He'd built Kell Marine and Development out of nothing, he liked to say, out of nothing, and everyone in Bell Harbor had learned to nod when he said it. He measured everything in dollars, and he'd never once been wrong about $1 in his life. He'd just been wrong about everything $1 couldn't count. Why did he leave me the boat? Norah said. It wasn't quite a question. Because you were the one who wouldn't take money from him, Wade said. You were too proud, so he gave you the one thing you couldn't turn down without looking ungrateful. He shrugged. That was Dad. Even his gifts had hooks in them. Pried slid a single sheet across the desk. This is the asset schedule and the transfer of documentation. If you intend to accept the vessel, I'll need a signature here. If you intend to sell it to Mr. Kell, we can note that instead and save you the yard charges. Norah looked at the paper. Under the vessel's name, someone had typed condition, poor, and recommend disposal. Recommend disposal. 2 words a man could put on 40 years of another man's life and never feel the weight of them. She thought about the last phone call. 6 weeks before he died, Amos had called her at the duplex in Ellery, his voice thin over the line, and he'd said, "When you get a chance, go down and see the Delia. Not sell her, just see her." And she'd said she would. The way you say you will when your shift starts at 6 and the rent is late and the coast is 3 hours you don't have. She'd meant to. She'd been meaning to come home for 20 years. "I'll take the boat," Norah said. Wade sat back. "You'll take the boat. I'll take the boat and the fees and everything aboard her." Norah. He said her name the way their father never had. Flat, a little tired. "There's nothing aboard her but rot and old rope. You're going to spend money. You don't have to keep a hole in the water that has your name on it." "For what? To prove something to a dead man?" Norah picked up Prewitt's pen. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of pen a man buys to feel like the papers he signs matter. She signed her name on the line. Nora Delia Kell, 4 letters longer than she'd written it in years because she'd gone back to it after the divorce and never gotten used to seeing it whole. "There," she said, and she set the pen down. "Now it's mine." Wade watched her the way he watched a bid come in higher than he'd planned for. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and told Prewitt he'd be in touch about the house. He stopped at the door. "The offer's good for a week," he said. "After that, you're on your own with it." "I've been on my own with it my whole life," Norah said. "One more boat won't change that." He left. Dana followed a minute later, squeezing Nora's shoulder on the way out, a small pressure that was supposed to mean something and didn't. Then it was just Norah and Prewitt and the smell of the carpet cleaner and a manila folder with a boat inside it. She carried the folder out to the parking lot and set it on the passenger seat of a 2004 Subaru wagon with 191,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on since February. She sat behind the wheel for a while without starting the engine. $93,000 to Dana, $93,000 and a house to Wade. And to Norah, a boat 2 men had already agreed was worth less than nothing. She should have felt robbed. She kept waiting for it. What she felt instead, sitting in that lot with her father 3 days in the ground, was the strangest thing. She felt chosen. She didn't have a single reason for it. Just her father's voice on a thin phone line telling her not to sell, and a word on a page, everything aboard her, that a lawyer had read like it meant nothing at all. Norah turned the key. The engine caught on the second try. She pulled out of the lot and pointed the Subaru east, toward the water, toward Bell Harbor, toward the pier and the last slip, and the boat with her name on the deed. She had $308 and no idea what was waiting for her aboard the Delia. She was about to find out. The drive to Bell Harbor took a little over 3 hours. The interstate gave way to a state highway, which gave way to Route 9, a 2-lane road that ran along the edge of the county through stands of spruce and past fields going brown at the end of October. Norah kept the radio off. The Subaru's heater worked on one setting, too hot, so she cracked the window and let the cold air in, and after a while the air changed. It picked up salt and diesel and the low green smell of mudflats at low tide, and she knew she was close before she saw the water. She'd grown up on this road. Her mother used to drive it every Friday in summer to bring Amos his supper when the boat came in late, Norah and Wade in the back seat counting lobster buoys in the yards. That was before Wade decided the harbor was something to be from instead of something to be part of. Norah had left too, at 19, for a bookkeeping job inland, and a man named Gerald Sorensen, who turned out to be Dana's problem before he was hers, and then a different man, and a duplex in Ellery, and 11 years of other people's numbers. She had not driven this road in 19 years. It knew her anyway. The curves came up under the tires exactly where her hands expected them. Bell Harbor was smaller than she remembered, the way everything from childhood is. Main Street ran 4 blocks down to the water. A hardware store. A diner with a hand-lettered sign that said Martin's. A bait shop with a closed sign and a for lease notice taped inside the glass. Past the shops, the road bent left along the waterfront, and there she saw what her brother's company had done to the place. New pilings. A fresh gravel lot behind a chain-link fence with a banner reading Future Home of Harbor Point Residences. A row of the old fish houses gone. Just their concrete pads left, pale rectangles where buildings used to stand. And past all of it, at the far end where the town pier ran out over the water on tired wooden legs, sat the Delia. Norah parked at the head of the pier and walked out. The planks gave under her feet, soft in places, and she stepped carefully. The boat was tied bow and stern to the last slip, riding low, a 40-foot wooden dragger with a high bow and a squat wheelhouse, and a name painted across her transom in white letters that had faded to the color of old bone. Delia, Bell Harbor, Maine. Below the waterline, her hull was furred green with weed. Rust ran in long orange streaks from every fitting. One wheelhouse window was cracked corner to corner and sealed with duct tape that had dried and curled back on itself. A gull stood on the mast and did not move as Norah came alongside. She had expected to feel nothing. She'd trained herself, over the years, to feel nothing about the things that used to be hers. She stepped down onto the deck and felt the boat take her weight and settle. The way a boat does, the way a living thing shifts to make room, and something in her chest came loose that she had not given it permission to. The wheelhouse door was unlocked. Inside, the air was still and cold and thick with the smell of him, diesel and pipe tobacco and the tar he used on the rigging, a smell she would have known blind in a crowd of 1,000 men. His oilskin coat hung on a hook by the door, yellow gone gray, the collar shaped to a neck that wasn't there anymore. His rubber boots stood under it, side by side, the way a careful man leaves his boots. On the chart table, a paper chart of the outer ledges lay unrolled, held flat at one corner by a coffee mug and at the other by his reading glasses, folded, one temple mended with a wrap of electrical tape. And on the chart, in pencil, in the small square hand she'd seen on birthday cards for 60 years, he had drawn a course. A line from the harbor mouth out past the 2-mile bell to a spot he'd marked with a careful X and a date. The date was a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks before he died. Beside the X, he had written 3 words, "Show Norah this." She stood holding the edge of the chart table for a long time. Outside, the tide worked at the pilings. A truck went by up on the road and faded. She did not cry. She'd done her crying at the funeral, standing between Wade and Dana while a minister who'd never met Amos said his name wrong twice. What she felt now was quieter than grief. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere years too late and finding the door still open, the light still on, the coffee still, impossibly warm. She picked up his glasses and cleaned the dust from the lenses with the hem of her shirt, the way she'd done for him 100 times as a girl when he lost them in his own shirt pocket. Then she set them back exactly where they'd been, folded on the chart, next to the pencil line and the 3 words, and she went to bring her bag in from the car, because the light was going and she had nowhere else in the world to be. She slept aboard that first night in the forward berth, in her clothes, under a wool blanket that smelled of mildew and him. The bunk was narrow and hard, and the boat moved under her all night. Small movements, a lift and a settle with the swell that worked its way into the harbor, and she woke a dozen times, not knowing where she was and then knowing. Water slapped the hull 6 inches from her ear. Somewhere a loose halyard tapped against the mast, a slow, patient knock, like something asking to be let in. In the morning she made an inventory, because that was what she knew how to do. She sat at the chart table with a legal pad and a pen, and she counted what she had. $308, minus $41 for the gas to get here, minus $9 for a sandwich and coffee at Marden's the night before, left $258. The Subaru had a quarter tank and a check engine light. The boat had, she'd learned from Prewitt's folder, $2,150 in back charges owed to the row boatyard, and the yard, according to a stapled notice, intended to place a lien and haul the vessel for disposal if the balance went unpaid past the 15th of November. She had 18 days. $258 in 18 days. The math did not work. She wrote it all down anyway, in her small, neat columns, because putting a true number on a bad thing had always made it easier to carry than pretending the number away. She spent the morning learning the boat. The engine was a diesel, old, greasy, but the fuel was clean when she cracked the filter bowl, and Amos had left everything the way a man leaves a tool he means to use again, wiped down, capped, coiled. The bilge held a few inches of water and the pump ran when she flipped the switch, so she wasn't sinking. Not this week. The wheelhouse leaked at the cracked window. The galley was a 2-burner stove and a sink with a hand pump and a locker with a can of coffee, sealed, and a tin of crackers gone soft. She made coffee in a dented pot because there was no other pot, and she drank it standing in the wheelhouse door looking out at the harbor doing what it did. People noticed her. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming. A man in a skiff ran his traps out past the slip and looked at the Delia twice and looked at Norah once and lifted 2 fingers off the tiller. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement, and kept going. A woman walked a small dog along the waterfront and stopped where the pier met the road and stood looking down the length of it at the boat, and when Nora raised a hand, the woman turned and walked away. Up at the head of the pier, a younger man in a canvas coat and the same feed store cap every man on the coast seemed to own leaned against a truck and watched the boat for the better part of an hour without coming down. Bell Harbor knew she was here. Bell Harbor was deciding what that meant. She understood. She was a Kell, and the last Kell they'd seen much of was Wade, whose banner was strung on a fence 100 yards up the shore over the concrete pads where the fish houses used to be. Nora didn't blame them for keeping their distance. She'd have kept hers too. The dog came on the second night. She heard it before she saw it, a scrabble of nails on the wet planks, and then a shape at the edge of the wheelhouse light, low to the deck, watching her the way the whole town watched her, from a careful distance, out of a habit of being turned away. It was a black dog going gray at the muzzle, ribs showing under a wet coat, one ear torn and healed crooked. A wharf dog. It stood at the rail with its weight back on its haunches, ready to run, and it looked at Nora and at the open door and at the light, and it did not come closer and it did not leave. Nora had half a can of tuna she'd bought at the hardware store's cooler that afternoon for $1 and change. She'd meant it for her supper. She spooned it onto a cracker box lid and set it on the deck and backed away and sat down on the engine box, and after a while the dog crossed the deck on its belly, quick, and ate the tuna in 3 swallows and licked the lid clean and then sat, 6 feet off, and looked at her, and its tail moved once against the planks. A single, cautious sweep. "There's no more," Nora said. "That was mine." The dog stayed anyway. It settled against the wheelhouse out of the wind, put its chin on its paws, and closed its eyes, and Nora sat on the engine box in the cold with $258 to her name and a boat 2 men had already sold for scrap in their minds, and she thought that she and the dog had arrived at the same place by the same road, running from the last thing that told them to leave, and neither of them had anywhere better to be. She left the wheelhouse door open that night. In the morning, the dog was still there, curled against the door, and when she stepped over it to make her coffee, it thumped its tail against the deck and did not move, as though the 2 of them had settled something in the dark without either one saying it out loud. Roy Tibbets came down the pier on the 4th morning. Slow, with a cane he didn't seem to trust and a paper bag under his arm. He was past 75, stooped, with hands that had been broken and healed so many times the knuckles stood up like knots in a rope. He stopped at the edge of the slip and looked at the boat the way a man looks at something he's grieving, and then he looked at Nora in the wheelhouse door, and his face did a thing that faces do when memory catches up to them all at once. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "You're Amos's girl. You're Nora. I am Roy Tibbets. I fished the ledges off this harbor for 51 years. Your daddy and I hauled the same water since before you were born." He lifted the paper bag an inch. "Ada down at the diner said somebody was living aboard the Delia. I told her she was wrong. Then I saw the light on last night from the road, and I figured I'd better come see for myself who'd have the nerve." Nora came up onto the pier and took his arm without asking, because he'd started down the last soft plank and she could see it wasn't going to hold him well, and he let her, which told her something about how his knees were. The dog came off the deck and stood at her hip, and Roy looked down at it. "That's the wharf dog," he said. "Nobody's been able to get within 10 feet of that animal in 2 years. Your father used to leave fish heads for it on the stringer." He shook his head. "And here it is, sleeping on his boat. Dogs know things we don't." They sat on the tailgate of Roy's truck up at the head of the pier because the pier itself was no place for his hips. He'd brought 2 egg sandwiches wrapped in wax paper from Martin's, and he handed Nora one without asking whether she was hungry, and she was, and she ate it while the tide worked below them. "Tell me about him," Nora said. "Tell me the things he wouldn't tell me." Roy chewed for a while and watched the water. "Your father was the quietest man I ever knew and the loudest thing that ever happened to this harbor, and I don't expect that makes sense to you yet." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You know what fishing is. It's good years and bad years and no telling which is coming. In a bad year, a man can lose his boat, his house, everything, over one blown engine or one season the fish don't show. And in 50 years, I never once saw a family in this harbor lose a boat. Not one. You ever wonder why?" "No," Nora said. "I never thought about it. Nobody did. That was the trick of it." Roy set the last of his sandwich down on the wax paper. A man would come up short on his fuel bill at the co-op and go home sick about it, and the next morning it would be paid, and the fella at the pump would say it must have been a mistake in the books. A boat would need a transmission the owner couldn't cover, and a rebuilt one would show up at the yard with no invoice. Widows in this town got their oil tanks filled every October for 30 years, and not one of them could tell you by who. He looked at her. People figured it was the church, or the town, or just luck. It wasn't any of those things. Norah sat very still. It was him. I only know because I caught him at it. One time, the way you catch a careful man once in 50 years. Roy almost smiled. Frank Doucette's boy drowned off the breakwater in a January storm, and Frank didn't have burying money, and I saw your father go down to the funeral home after dark and pay it in cash and tell the man to keep his name out of it. When I braced him about it, you know what he said? He said, "Roy, it's cheaper than a church and it does more good, and I don't have to sit through the singing." Roy laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough, and he let it pass. He carried half this harbor on his back for 40 years and never once let anybody thank him. Wouldn't have known what to do with a thank you if you handed it to him gift-wrapped. A gull came down and stood on the truck's fender, and Roy waved it off without looking at it. "Why didn't he ever tell me any of this?" Norah said. "Because to him it wasn't anything," Roy said. "It was just what you did if you had a good year and your neighbor didn't. He didn't think it needed a name." He turned and looked at her straight on for the first time. "Your brother thinks the harbor is money, Norah, pilings and permits and them signs he's got strung on the fence. He never once understood that the man who made this harbor worth anything gave it all away for nothing and died with less in the bank than half the men who owed him their boats." He nodded toward the Delia, low and green in the slip. "Whatever your father left you, it ain't that boat. That boat's just where he kept it. He wouldn't take a ride home." He left the second egg sandwich for the dog, climbed into his truck, and told her he'd come back when his hips let him, and he pulled out onto Route 9 slow enough that Norah could have walked beside him. She stood at the head of the pier a long while after the truck was gone, looking down the length of it at the boat, at the light she'd left on in the wheelhouse, at the words in her father's hand she'd been turning over in her mind for 4 days. "Whatever your father left you, it ain't that boat. That boat's just where he kept it." She went back aboard. She started with the wheelhouse and worked forward, because a bookkeeper starts where the light is best and moves into the dark. She found nothing in the wheelhouse but charts and a locked drawer she couldn't open, and the ordinary papers of a working boat, licenses gone yellow, a logbook of tides and catches in his small square hand. She found nothing in the galley but the coffee and the crackers and a jar of hooks. It was in the forward berth, on her knees in the cramped triangle of the bow with a flashlight in her teeth, that she felt it. The bunk was a plywood platform over a storage void, the way they always are, and the void was empty except for coiled line and a spare anchor. But the aft face of the void, the bulkhead that should have been wood like everything else, was steel. A steel plate, painted the same gray as the wood so you wouldn't look at it twice, bolted flush to the frame with 6 bolts. She ran her thumb along the seam. Cold air moved against her skin from somewhere behind it, steady and patient, the way air moves when there's a space beyond that's been closed a long time. She knew her father. He did not put steel where wood would do unless he meant to keep something. The bolts were 3/8 and rusted, and she had $250 and no money for a mechanic. But Amos Kell's tools hung on a board in the engine room exactly where he'd left them, each one wiped and set in its place, and among them was a ratchet with a grip worn smooth by his hand. She soaked the bolts with oil from his can, and she worked them one at a time on her knees in the dark, and the first took 20 minutes, and the last came in 5, because by then she'd found the angle, the way you find the angle, the way he'd taught her to find it on a summer afternoon 50 years gone. The dog lay in the berth behind her the whole time with its chin on its paws and watched. The plate came away with a dry scrape. Behind it was a shallow, dry compartment lined with tar paper, and in the compartment, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, were 3 things. A leather ledger, thick, soft at the corners, bound shut with a loop of net twine, a gray metal box the size of a bread tin, and a bundle of envelopes tied with the same tarred twine he'd used on his rigging for 60 years. Norah lifted the ledger out with both hands. It was heavier than a book that size should be, heavy the way a thing is heavy when it holds more than paper. She sat down on the edge of the bunk, and the boat took her weight and settled, and she slid the twine off and opened to the first page. His hand. The date at the top. October 1979. Paid Emil Sears fuel at the co-op, $41. His engine's going and he won't say. Told Bud at the pump it was a bookkeeping error. Emil can't know or he won't take it. She turned the page. Bought Sylvie Doucette's whole catch at the dock. Top price, 42 pounds of hake nobody wanted, and gave it to the food pantry in Ellery under no name. Frank's been gone a year. She's raising the 2 girls alone and too proud to take $1. She'll take a fair price for fish, so I buy the fish. Page after page. A name, an amount, a reason. Every fuel bill, every rebuilt transmission, every catch bought at top dollar and given away, every oil tank filled in October. 40 years of it, hundreds of entries, each one a small kindness he'd hidden so carefully that a whole harbor had spent half a century calling it luck. Norah sat in the bow of her father's boat in the last of the light and read the record of a man she'd buried without knowing. And outside the tide came up around the pilings, and the loose halyard tapped its slow, patient knock against the mast. And for the first time since the lawyer's office, she understood that she had not been left the smallest thing after all. She had been left the only thing that mattered. And she had 18 days, now 14, to find out what it was for before her brother's yard came to haul it away. Norah read the ledger until the light was gone, and then she lit the oil lamp from the galley locker because the boat's batteries were down to nothing, and she read on by the yellow flame with the dog against her leg. The entries ran in order, year over year, and as they went, the harbor she thought she'd grown up in came apart and rebuilt itself into something she'd never seen. She had known these names her whole life. She had not known what her father had been to the people who wore them. The gray metal box she opened second. It was the kind you bought at any hardware store, and inside it was not the fortune Wade would have looked for. There were $216 in soft bills, a key she didn't recognize, brass and flat, and a folded document that turned out to be the original vessel documentation, the Delia's first papers, dated 1972, her father's name written out full and young and certain. Under the papers, at the bottom of the box, was a second, smaller ledger, and this one was different. This one had columns. She turned it to the lamp. It was a repayment book. On the left, the same names from the big ledger, the men and women he'd carried. On the right, in his hand, what they'd paid back and when, a few dollars at a time, over years, and beside a good many of the names, instead of a figure, one word, forgiven. He had kept a running account of every family in the harbor, not of what they owed him, but of what they needed. And when they couldn't pay, he'd drawn a line through the debt and written that one word and never mentioned it to a living soul. The envelopes she saved for last, because her hands weren't steady, and she knew somehow that the envelopes would be the worst of it. There were 9 of them, tied in the tarred twine, each addressed in a different hand, all to Amos. Thank you notes. A woman named Sir, whose family would have lost the boat that fed them. A man named Doucette who wrote 3 lines on the back of a fish market receipt and could not seem to find a 4th. Letters on notebook paper and on the flaps of torn envelopes, from people who had figured out, eventually, the way people always eventually figure out, who it was that had caught them in the dark, and who had waited until he was too old to run from the gratitude to finally say it. Norah read all 9. Then she set them on the chart table beside his mended glasses, and she put her face in her hands, not crying, just holding her own face the way you hold something you're afraid you'll drop. It was near the end of the big ledger that she found Wade. The entries had been thinning as the years wore on, the amounts smaller, the hand shakier, the harbor slower, fewer boats each season working out of the town pier. But the entries never stopped. And 3 years before Amos died, in a page dated in early spring, she found her brother's company written into her father's private book, and the words beside it were not soft. Kell Marine bought the Peterson fish house and the Doucette pad and the old net shed off the town for back taxes. Wade's the buyer behind the paper. He's putting condos on the working waterfront, and he means to close the town pier when he's got the votes, because a working pier lowers the price of a water view. He came to see me. Asked me to sell him the Delia and my slip so the last dragger would be gone and the pier would have no reason to stay. I told him no. He said I was standing in the way of the only money this harbor's ever going to see. I told him this harbor's seen 40 years of money he never counted because it never touched a bank. He didn't know what I meant. That's the whole trouble with my son. He never knew what I meant. Norah read it twice. Then she read the next entry, dated a week later. I've been to the county office. The pilot moorings and the pier itself sit on a right-of-way. The town granted this family in 1951, in my father's name, for keeping a working boat on the harbor in perpetuity. As long as a documented Kell vessel works out of that slip, the pier stays public and the town can't sell the bottom out from under it. Wade doesn't know it's there. It's in the old book at the registry, filed under my father's name, not mine, which is why his lawyers never found it. The day there's no Kell boat on that slip, the right-of-way lapses and the waterfront's his. So the boat has to stay. Whatever else happens, the boat has to stay. If Norah ever comes home, she needs to understand that. The Delia isn't a boat. She's the last thing standing between this harbor and my son. The lamp guttered. The dog lifted its head. Out on the water, the bell buoy off the 2-mile ledge tolled once, slow, carried in on the tide, the same bell her father had drawn a course toward on the chart above her head, 6 weeks before he died, with 3 words in pencil. Show Norah this. She understood now why he hadn't sold. She understood why the appraisal said $4,000 and recommend disposal, and why Wade had offered her $500 to make it go away, and why he'd smiled when he said it. It had never been about the boat's worth. It had been about the boat's existence. As long as the Delia sat in that slip, documented, a working Kell vessel, her brother could not close the pier, could not sell the bottom, could not put his residences where the fish houses used to stand. And in 18 days, now 13, the row boatyard was going to haul the Delia away for $2,150 in back charges, and the right-of-way would lapse, and Wade would have won without ever having to fight her for it. He hadn't needed to break the will. He'd only needed her to run out of money before she found out what she was holding. Norah sat in the wheelhouse a long time after that. The harbor was black, and the stars came out over the water in numbers she'd forgotten existed, and the boat moved under her, small and patient, lifting and settling with the swell. She had $250 in 13 days, and a brother who owned half the shore and every lawyer in the county. By any accounting she'd ever kept, the numbers did not work. But she was a Kell, and she had just learned what that had meant for 40 years, and she found that she was not doing the math anymore. She was doing something her father had done every year of his life. She was deciding to stay. Wade found out she'd stayed on the 9th day. She heard the truck before she saw it, up on the road, the deep, even sound of an engine that had never wanted for anything, and she came up out of the engine room, wiping her hands on a rag as a silver crew cab pulled onto the gravel at the head of the pier. Wade got out on one side. A younger man in a gray suit got out on the other, a leather folder under his arm and shoes that were wrong for a working waterfront, and the two of them stood looking down the length of the pier at the Delia and at Norah on her deck. And then Wade came down the planks slow and careful and stopped where the slip began, because he knew the pier and didn't trust it either. "You're still here," Wade said. "I'm still here," I heard. "Ada at the diner's been telling everybody her father's daughter came home and moved onto that wreck." He shook his head. He was in a barn coat that cost more than her car, and he looked at the boat the way he looked at a parcel before he bought it, reading the bones, pricing the tear down. "Norah, I'm going to say this once, as your brother and not as anything else. Take the $500. Take it today. That yard's going to haul her on the 15th and put a disposal charge on top of the $2,150, and it'll follow you. They can come after you for it, and you don't have it. I know you don't have it." He said it gently, the way he'd said everything gently in the lawyer's office. And it was the gentleness that gave him away, because a man who wanted nothing didn't need to be that kind about it. "Let me make it go away. I'm trying to help you." "You're trying to buy the slip," Norah said. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, the recalculation of a man who'd expected the old Norah and gotten a stranger. The lawyer at the head of the pier shifted his weight. "The slip comes with the boat," Wade said. "That's just how it's titled." "I know how it's titled," Norah said. "I've been reading how it's titled. 1951. Grandfather's name. In perpetuity." She watched the words land on him, watched him understand for the first time that she knew, and watched him decide, in the space of a breath, to stop pretending she didn't. "That's why it's $500, Wade. That's why it was never $14,000 or $4,000 or anything else. You didn't want a boat. You wanted the last Kell vessel off this harbor before anybody figured out what it was holding down." For a moment, her brother said nothing. The tide worked at the pilings. A gull came over and neither of them looked at it. "You've been aboard 3 days," Wade said finally. "And you think you understand a thing our father spent 40 years making a mess of?" His voice had gone flat, the gentleness burned off, and underneath it was the thing she'd waited her whole childhood to hear him say plain. He gave it all away, Norah. Everything he ever made, he handed to people who couldn't hold on to their own boats, and he died with nothing, and he called it generosity. I built something. I built the only future this harbor is ever going to have, and the one thing standing in the way of it is a rotten boat he left to the one person too stubborn to be reasonable. He looked at her, and for just a second there was something almost like grief in it. "I'll see you at the yard on the 15th, he said. "One way or the other, that boat comes off this slip." He turned and walked back up the pier, careful on the soft planks, and the lawyer opened the truck door for him, and they were gone. Nora stood on the deck with the rag still in her hands and the dog against her leg and 13 days on the calendar, and she looked down at her father's ledger open on the engine box in the gray light. 400 names, 40 years, and one word written over and over beside the debts of people who could not pay. Forgiven. She closed the book. She did not have $2,150, but she had 400 names, and every one of them owed her father something they had never been allowed to repay, and for the first time she thought she understood what the boat was actually for. The town rose the way weather rises off the water, slow, and then all at once. Norah started with the 9 envelopes, because the 9 had already found the courage once. She copied the names out of the big ledger onto the back of a fuel receipt, and she did not knock on doors, because she was a Kell and a stranger and a woman who'd been aboard 3 weeks, and a door was a hard thing to knock on. Instead, she did what her father had done. She let the harbor come to her. She began keeping the wheelhouse door open and the coffee on. She'd bought a can of it and a percolator at the hardware store for $4, and she set it on the engine box just inside the door where a man could see the steam from the pier, the way her father, she now understood, had always kept his light on and his door open and his coffee going for anyone who needed a place to stand out of the wind. And they came. Not all at once. A lobsterman named Sear tied up at the pier one morning to run a line he didn't need to run there, and stood on the planks looking at the boat, and Nora came up and said her father's name, and the man's face changed, and he said, "Lo, your daddy paid my grandfather's fuel bill for 11 winters and told everybody it was the co-op's mistake." "I know," Nora said. "It's in his book. He wrote it down." The man went still. "He wrote it down?" "He wrote all of it down. 40 years of it." By the end of that week, the pier had more traffic than it had seen since the fish houses came down. They came under the excuse of coffee. A woman named Sylvie Doucette, gray now, who had been a girl selling hake off the dock the day Amos bought her whole catch at top price and gave it away. A man named Emil Sir's son, Roy Tibbets, twice, once with his own coffee just to sit. They stood on the deck and Nora showed them the ledger, and one by one they found their own names in her father's small square hand, or their parents' names, or the names of people they'd buried, and the amount, and the reason, and besides so many of them, the one word he'd written when they couldn't pay: forgiven. Nobody had known how many there were. Each of them had thought they were the only one. That was the thing the book did that nothing else could have. It showed a harbor full of people, each carrying one private debt of gratitude in the dark, that they were not alone, that they had never been alone, that a whole town had been held up for 40 years by a man who'd made every one of them believe it was luck. It was Sylvie Doucette who said the thing that turned it. She was standing in the wheelhouse door with the repayment book open in her hands, the one with the columns, and she found her husband's funeral in it, the burying money paid in cash after dark, and the word beside it, and she looked up at Norah with her face gone wet and said, "The town votes on the pier next Tuesday. Wade Kell's people. They mean to declare it surplus and sell the bottom." She closed the book. "He told everybody the last boat's getting hauled on the 15th for back charges, and then there's no reason to keep a public pier. He's been saying it for a year." She held the book against her chest the way Norah had held it. "He didn't count on there being a Kell boat left." "There's a Kell boat left for 6 more days, Norah said. "The yard hauls her on the 15th. The vote's the day before. If she's gone off the slip, the right-of-way lapses and the vote doesn't matter." Sylvie looked at her a long moment. Then she set the ledger down, careful, and she said, "Then she's not getting hauled," and she walked up the pier to her truck, and Norah watched her go and did not yet understand what she'd set in motion. The money came the way the coffee had come. Not as charity, because these were not people who could stand to give or take charity, but as repayment, at last, of a debt they had spent decades not being permitted to pay. It came in envelopes left on the engine box. It came folded into a coffee mug and handed back empty. Sir's son ran a check to the row boatyard himself and told them it was against the Delia's account and to keep his name off it. And when Nora heard, she laughed until she had to sit down, because it was her father's own trick run backward, the harbor paying his boat's debt in the dark the way he'd paid theirs. Roy Tibbets brought a coffee can with 40 years of change in it and would not say another word about it. The hardware store took up a jar by the register. It was not one grand gift. It was 200 small ones, the way the fund in the ledger had been built, dollar over dollar, and by the 11th day the $2,150 in back charges to the row yard was paid in full, and the yard's disposal order was withdrawn, and the Delia stayed exactly where she was. Wade came on the 12th day, and he came alone. No truck this time. He walked down from the head of the pier in his barn coat with his hands in his pockets, and he stood at the edge of the slip, and Nora came up onto the deck and did not offer him coffee. Below them the tide was making, and the Delia sat a little higher than she had 3 weeks before, because a man named Sear had scrubbed her waterline, and another had patched the cracked wheelhouse glass, and the bone-colored letters on her transom had been painted fresh and white by a girl whose grandmother had once sold hake off this dock. Wade looked at the boat a long time. "You paid the yard," he said. "The harbor paid the yard." I heard how. His jaw worked. "Sir, Tibbets, everybody whose name's in that book of his." He looked at her, and for once there was nothing gentle in it, and nothing hard either, just a man looking at a thing he'd gotten wrong. "You know, I have the votes for Tuesday. The pier gets declared surplus, the town sells me the bottom, and it doesn't matter whose boat's on the slip. I've had the votes for a year." "You don't have the votes," Nora said. "You had the votes when it was a rotten boat and a right-of-way nobody remembered." She reached into her coat and brought out the folded copy sheet had made at the county registry, the 1951 grant in their grandfather's name, in perpetuity, and she held it up so he could see it in the gray light. "This is filed now, Wade. It's read into the record. The whole harbor knows what it is and what our father did to keep it and what you were trying to do around it. Sylvie Doucette's speaking at the meeting. So's Roy, so am I." She folded the paper back into her coat. "You can still hold your vote, but you'll be holding it in a room full of people who just found out who kept their boats afloat for 40 years and who tried to sell the pier out from under him before he was cold. You've always been good at counting the room. Count it." For a long moment Wade Kell said nothing. A gull came down and stood on the piling between them, and neither of them waved it off. When he spoke, his voice had gone quiet, and under the quiet was the thing she'd waited her whole life to hear him almost say. "He never told me either," Wade said. "About the book. Any of it." He looked at the boat, and the fresh white letters, and the light in the wheelhouse. "All I ever saw was a man giving away everything I was trying to build, and dying with nothing to show for it. I thought he was a fool." He stopped. "I didn't know the whole harbor was the thing he had to show for it." "You could have," Nora said, not unkindly. "You just had to measure something a bank can't count." Wade stood there with his hands in his pockets and his father's harbor in front of him, and then he nodded once, at nothing, and he turned and walked back up the pier, careful on the soft planks. He did not say he would withdraw the vote, but on Tuesday he did not appear to force it, and his 2 council members, in a room with Roy Tibbets and Sylvie Doucette and 400 names, moved to preserve the town pier as a public working waterfront in perpetuity, in honor, the motion read, of Amos Kell. It passed without a vote against. Nora sat in the back with the dog's leash in her hand, because they'd let her bring the dog, and she did not cry. And afterwards Sylvie Doucette found her in the parking lot and put both arms around her and said nothing at all, which was exactly enough. The dogwoods along Route 9 were blooming when the Delia went back to work. It had taken through the winter. A man named Sear rebuilt the injector pump on a bench in the co-op and would not send a bill. Roy Tibbets came down on the good days and sat on the engine box with his cane across his knees and told Nora what her father had done in a hard sea, what the boat liked and didn't, how to read the 2-mile bell in fog. The cracked wheelhouse glass was gone, replaced with a clean pane a girl's grandmother had paid for out of a debt, 60 years old. The bone-colored letters on the transom were white now. And on a warm morning in April, with the tide making and half the harbor standing on the town pier under the banner the council had never taken down, Nora Kell turned the key her father had turned 10,000 times, and the diesel caught on the second try, coughed once, and settled into a low, even idle that Roy said, from the pier, sounded exactly like Amos. She ran her first trip out past the 2-mile bell to the ledges her father had marked on the chart, to the careful X and the date and the 3 words, and she hauled a short string of gear a man named Sear had lent her, and she came back in with 40 pounds of fish and sold it at the co-op at a fair price and paid her fuel and had money left over, and that night she wrote it all down. She had bought a new ledger at the hardware store, and she kept it in the gray tin box in the compartment behind the steel plate, next to her father's. And on the first page, under his last entry, she had written the first of her own. She kept the columns the way he had. On the left, the names. On the right, when someone came up short, the same word he'd used, because she had learned what it was for. Forgiven. The town pier stayed public. Wade did not fight it. He kept his gravel lot and his pilings up the shore, and the banner that had read Future Home of Harbor Point Residences came down over the winter, and nothing went up in its place. And in March, a permit was filed, quietly, that Norah heard about the way she heard about everything now, through Ada at the diner, to rebuild 2 of the old fish houses on their concrete pads as a working co-op for the harbors. Boats. The buyer behind the paper was Kell Marine. Nobody said Wade's name when they told her. Nobody needed to. He had measured something, at last, that a bank could not count, and if it had come too late to be forgiveness, it was near enough to it that Norah let it stand. He came down to the pier one Sunday in the spring and stood at the head of it and looked at the boat with its fresh letters and its light on, and he did not come down, and Norah did not call him down, and after a while he lifted 2 fingers off the rail, the way the men of the harbor did, and she raised her hand, and that was as much as the 2 of them had ever been able to say, and more than they'd said. In 30 years, the dog stayed. It slept on the deck in fair weather and in the forward berth when it blew, and it rowed out to the ledges with her and stood in the bow with its torn ear into the wind, and the men on the pier called it the Delia's dog, and Norah never did give it another name because it had come to her already knowing who it was, the way she had come to the boat. Lena Doucette came in May. She was 17, Sylvie's granddaughter, and she had aged out of nothing and run from nothing. She'd only grown up in the harbor watching, but she came down the pier one morning with her hands in her pockets and asked if Norah needed a stern hand, and Norah, who was 61 and whose knees told her the truth about the winters ahead, said she did. She taught the girl what Roy had taught her and what her father had taught her 50 years before that, how to read a tire tread of water, how to listen to the engine and hear what was wrong, how to splice a line so it held. And she taught her the other thing too, the thing that wasn't in any manual, the thing you kept in a tin box behind a steel plate and wrote down in a small square hand and never spoke of. How to catch a neighbor in the dark. How to call it a bookkeeping error. How to keep the coffee on and the light on and the door open for whoever came up the pier out of the wind. On a warm evening at the end of May, with the trip sold and the gear squared away and the girl gone home to her grandmother's, Norah sat on the engine box with a mug of coffee and the dog against her leg and watched the light go down over the harbor. The water turned from blue to gray to black. The bell tolled once off the ledges. Up on the road, a truck went by and faded. The fish houses were coming back on their pads, framed and waiting for their roofs. The pier held under her, soft in places, but holding, the way her father had held the whole harbor, the way the harbor had held her. She had come down this coast in October with $308 and a boat 2 men had already sold for scrap in their minds, meaning to see the thing and be done with it and go back to a duplex in Ellery and a life of other people's numbers. She had been 61 years old, divorced, cut out of a will, sleeping in her clothes under a dead man's blanket, with no plan and no place and nowhere in the world she was expected to be. She picked up her father's glasses off the chart table, the ones with the mended temple, and she cleaned the dust from them with the hem of her shirt the way she'd done 10,000 times, and she set them back exactly where he'd left them, folded on the chart, next to a course line drawn 6 weeks before he died and 3 words in pencil that had brought her home. Home isn't the place they leave you. It's the place you decide to stay and hold the line for whoever comes next. The light in the wheelhouse burned against the dark water. The door stood open. The coffee was on. Nora Kell was 61 years old, and she was just getting started.